spent 18 years building something that most people will never see. Not a building, not a product you can hold in your hand. I built a system that keeps a city's water running when everything else is falling apart. Emergency response logistics for municipal infrastructure. That's the technical way to say it. What it actually means is this. When a pipe bursts at 2 in the morning during a February freeze and 40,000 households lose pressure, my protocols are the reason crews show up to the right location with the right equipment in under 40 minutes instead of 3 hours. I designed that. I wrote every decision tree, every failsafe, every contingency branch. 18 years. My wife Diane has a picture on our mantle from the year I started. I'm 34 years old in that photo, holding a rolled up set of schematics under one arm and squinting into the sun like I'm trying to see something far away. She says I had that look the whole first decade, like I was always looking at something no one else could see yet. She's probably right. The company was called Meridian Infrastructure Solutions. Mid-sized, privately owned, not the kind of name that makes the news unless something goes very wrong. We had contracts with 11 municipal water authorities across the Southeast. When I joined, we had 3. I built the other 8, not alone. I had teams, good ones, people I trusted, but the framework that won those contracts was mine. The methodology was mine. The operational code that made our response times the best in the industry was mine. It lived in a system called CREST, Consolidated Response and Emergency Systems Technology. I named it. I spent 2 years building it before it ever went live. I spent the next 16 refining it. The CEO, a man named Aldrich, used to introduce me at client meetings as the reason we win. He'd say it with this particular pride, like a father talking about a son who'd done well. I believed him. That was probably my first mistake. His actual son was named Preston. Preston joined the company about 4 years before things fell apart. He had an MBA from a school I won't name, but you'd recognize, no operational experience, and the absolute unshakable confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. Aldrich made him VP of Strategic Development, which was a title that meant he sat in meetings and asked questions that revealed he hadn't read the brief. I tried in the beginning. I really did. I answered his questions. I walked him through CREST on 3 separate occasions. I introduced him to my senior engineers, explained the architecture, showed him what we'd built and why it worked. He would nod, make notes on a yellow legal pad, and then in the next meeting propose something that would have broken the entire system. It was like trying to teach someone to drive while they kept reaching for the steering wheel. 2 years before the acquisition talk started, Aldrich brought me into his office and told me that Meridian was growing faster than the family structure could sustain. He wanted to bring in institutional capital. There were 3 potential buyers interested. He said the deal would likely close somewhere between $150 and $200 million depending on the multiple they negotiated. Then he slid a folder across his desk. Inside was an amended employment agreement. The core of it was simple: if I remained with the company through the completion of any acquisition, and if CREST continued to perform at its current benchmarks through the transition period, I would receive a payment of $112,000. That was the retention bonus. But there was a second clause, one I read 3 times before I looked up. If my employment was terminated without cause before the bonus payment date, full intellectual property rights to CREST reverted to me personally. I asked why that clause was there. Aldrich leaned back in his chair and said, "Because you built it, and because I want you to know that if something goes sideways in the process, you won't walk away with nothing." I signed the agreement. I had my attorney review it first. She flagged nothing alarming. She did say, in her measured way, that the IP reversion clause was unusual. "Strong," she said. "Very clean." I told her Aldrich had always been straight with me. "People change," she said, "when there's $150 million on the table." I told her she was being cautious. She said that was what I paid her for. I should have listened more carefully to that part. The acquisition process took 14 months. The buyer was a publicly traded infrastructure conglomerate out of Atlanta, and their due diligence team was thorough in the way that large institutional buyers are thorough, which is to say they wanted documentation for everything, including documentation of things I'd never thought to document because they had simply always existed in my head and in CREST's architecture. I spent 4 of those 14 months doing nothing but responding to due diligence requests, technical audits, system walkthroughs, calls with their integration team at 6 in the morning because Atlanta runs earlier than we do. I did all of it. I answered every question. I handed them the keys to understanding everything I'd built, piece by piece, because that was my job and because I believed I was going to be there to help them use it. The bonus payment date was a Tuesday in March. 60 days before it, I was called into a conference room. Preston was already there when I walked in. So was a woman I'd met once before, their new HR director, who had joined 8 months earlier and reported directly to Preston. She had a folder in front of her. She didn't look at me when I sat down. Preston said, "We've made a decision to restructure your role as part of the integration planning process." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "We're eliminating your position effective immediately." There was a pause. Not a long one. I've had longer pauses looking for my keys in the morning. But everything in that pause was very loud. I said, 60 days before my retention bonus. He said, "The timing is what it is." I said, "Did your father approve this?" Something shifted in his expression. Just slightly. He said, "My father is confident in the decisions being made at the leadership level." That was not an answer. I noticed that it was not an answer. I also noticed that Aldrich was not in the room. The HR director slid a separation agreement across the table. It included a severance number that was, frankly, insulting. It also included a non-disclosure agreement and a clause in which I would acknowledge that all intellectual property I had developed during my tenure belonged exclusively to Meridian Infrastructure Solutions. I looked at that clause for a long time. Then I looked at Preston. I said, "I need to review this with my attorney before I sign anything." He said, "Of course, we'd like it back by end of week." I picked up the folder. I stood up. I said, "I'll be in touch." I walked to my office, got my laptop, got the personal hard drive I kept in my desk drawer, encrypted, backed up to 2 separate cloud accounts. The habit of someone who had spent 18 years making sure nothing important existed in only one place, and I left the building. I called my attorney from the parking lot. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Don't sign anything. Don't communicate with them in writing without routing it through me. And tell me you still have a copy of your original employment agreement." I told her I had 3. She said, "Good boy. Here's what I need you to understand about the next 4 days because the timeline matters." The acquisition was scheduled to close on the second Friday of that same March. Due diligence had been completed. The purchase agreement had been executed in principle. The buyer's integration team had been briefed. The deal was, by every external measure, done. What the buyer did not know, because there was no reason for anyone to have told them, was that my employment had just been terminated. What the buyer also did not know, because it existed in a private contract between me and Aldrich, and because Preston had apparently either not read the original agreement carefully or had decided the clause didn't matter, was that my termination had just triggered the reversion of CREST's intellectual property to me personally. My attorney confirmed this within 6 hours of me leaving the building. She'd reviewed the original agreement against the termination. She called it airtight. She also said with a flatness in her voice that I had learned over the years meant she was choosing her words very carefully. "They just handed you the whole system." I said, "I know." She said, "What do you want to do with it?" I told her I wanted to sleep on it. I meant that literally. I went home. I told Diane what had happened. She sat with me at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She didn't tell me what to do. That's one of the things I've always loved about her. She knows the difference between the times I need advice and the times I just need someone to sit in the room with me while I figure it out. I went to bed. I didn't sleep, not really, but I lay in the dark and I thought about 18 years. I thought about every Sunday I'd spent at that office when I didn't have to be there. Every vacation I'd cut short. Every school event I'd rescheduled because a system audit needed me. I thought about the look on Preston's face when he said, "The timing is what it is," like 60 days was just a rounding error. I got up at 4:30 in the morning and I called my attorney. She answered on the second ring. I don't know if she'd been asleep. I told her what I wanted to do. The acquiring company's legal team received a certified letter from my attorney's office the following morning. The letter was 4 pages long. It documented my employment history, the terms of my original agreement with Aldrich, the IP reversion clause in full, my termination date, and the circumstances thereof. and the legal conclusion that CREST, the system on which the entire acquisition's operational value was predicated, was now my personal intellectual property and not an asset of Meridian Infrastructure Solutions. The letter did not demand anything. It did not threaten anything. It simply stated the facts, clearly, with the relevant contract language attached as exhibits, and invited the acquiring company's counsel to respond at their earliest convenience. I found out later that it arrived at 9:17 on a Wednesday morning. By 11:45, the acquisition was on hold. I know this because at 12:08 my phone rang. It was Aldrich. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 2 minutes and 40 seconds long. I listened to it once. He was not yelling. Aldrich never yelled. It wasn't his style. But there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. A tightness. A kind of controlled urgency that told me he had spent the morning in rooms full of lawyers and the morning had not gone well for him. He said he wanted to talk. He said there had been a miscommunication. He said Preston had acted without full information. He did not say he was sorry. I noticed that. I did not call him back. I texted my attorney and told her Aldrich had called. She told me not to respond to anything directly and that she was already on the phone with the buyer's counsel. Preston called at 2 in the afternoon. I didn't answer. He called again at 4. I didn't answer. At 4:47, he left a voicemail. I'm going to be honest with you. I've listened to that voicemail more than once since then. Not out of malice, or not entirely. More because it was the first time in 4 years of working alongside that man that I heard him sound genuinely uncertain. He said that he thought the IP clause was a legacy provision that had been superseded by standard employment terms. He said he hadn't realized. He said there was a lot of money at stake and that he hoped we could resolve this as professionals. I thought about the conference room, the HR director who wouldn't look at me, the folder with the insulting severance number. As professionals, I did not call him back. The deal was supposed to close on Friday. On Thursday afternoon, my attorney called me with an update. The buyer had suspended the closing pending legal review. Their position was straightforward. If CREST belonged to me and not to Meridian, then the asset they were paying $178 million for had a significant cloud on its title. They were not willing to close with that unresolved, quote. Aldrich's legal team had spent 2 days trying to find a counter-argument. From what my attorney understood, they'd found 3 different angles, pursued all 3, and watched all 3 fall apart under the weight of the original contract language. The clause was, as she had told me from the beginning, very clean. On Friday morning, the day the deal was supposed to close, I received a formal written proposal from Meridian's counsel. They wanted to negotiate a license agreement. Basically, pay me a fee for the right to include CREST in the acquisition. My attorney and I talked about it for an hour. I told her to make a counterproposal. The counterproposal was not a license. It was a buyout. CREST's IP fully and permanently with a valuation based on the revenue it had generated for Meridian over 18 years and a multiple that reflected its role in the acquisition's total value. The number was not small. I'll tell you this. It was significantly more than the retention bonus that Preston had decided I didn't deserve. The deal did not close on Friday. It did not close the following week either. What happened over the next 22 days was a negotiation I was not directly involved in. My attorney handled it, which is exactly what attorneys are for, but which I was kept closely informed about. Aldrich's team pushed back on the valuation. My attorney held the line. The buyer's team, for their part, grew increasingly impatient. They had board approvals contingent on the original timeline. Their own shareholders were watching. Every day the deal didn't close cost everyone in the room money except me. Meridian agreed to the buyout on a Thursday evening. My attorney called me at 8:42 p.m. I was on the back porch with Diane. We'd grilled chicken, the ordinary kind of dinner that tastes better than anything when you've had 3 weeks that felt like a decade. My attorney said 3 words. They took it. Diane heard them. She put her hand on my arm. I thanked my attorney. I sat there for a while after I hung up. The neighborhood was quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes at the end of a long run of noise. Diane asked me how I felt. I thought about it honestly. Tired, I said. And okay, she said. That's enough. The deal closed the following Tuesday. CREST, with my IP now properly transferred and fully documented, was part of the transaction. I received my payment 17 days after closing, per the terms of the agreement my attorney had negotiated. It was wired to an account I had opened specifically for this purpose on the advice of my financial advisor, who had been briefed and was, in his measured financial advisor way, quietly enthusiastic about the outcome. I never went back to the Meridian building. I had no reason to. I heard from a former colleague of mine, someone I'd worked with for 11 years, one of the original CREST engineers, a person whose opinion I trust entirely, that the mood at Meridian in the weeks following the closing was, as he put it, not great. Preston had apparently been informed in very direct terms by his father that his decision-making had created a significant problem. Whether that conversation changed anything between them is not mine to know. I hope Aldrich is okay. I mean that genuinely. He was good to me for a long time, and whatever happened in those last months, whatever calculus led to Preston making that call, I don't think it reflects the full measure of who he is. People make mistakes when there's a lot of money in the room. I made peace with that. Preston, I have less peace about. But I also think about him less than I expected to. He is what he is. I spent 4 years trying to explain to him how something worked. Some people are not ready to understand things until they've had to pay for not understanding them. He paid. I took the summer off. That sounds simple when I say it. It was, actually, the strangest experience I'd had in years. I had no system to manage, no on-call rotation, no 6 a.m. calls from Atlanta. I woke up at whatever time I woke up. I drank coffee on the porch with Diane. We drove up to her sister's place in North Carolina for 2 weeks, sat by a lake, read actual books. Our younger daughter, who was 23 and just finishing a master's program, came and visited for a long weekend. We talked about her work, her life, things that had nothing to do with emergency response logistics. It turned out I was good at having mornings. I had not known that about myself. In the fall, I started doing some consulting work. Not full-time. I was careful about that, but there are water authorities around the country that are still running on outdated response systems, and I had 18 years of knowledge in my head that was useful to people who needed it. I work with 3 clients now. I set my own hours. I charge well because my attorney encouraged me to charge what I'm worth, and I have made my peace with doing exactly that. Last month, one of the engineers who used to be on my CREST team called me. He's looking at a new opportunity, asked if I'd be a reference. Of course I would. We talked for an hour about the old days, about the good parts, about what it felt like when the system worked the way it was supposed to work, and you got a call at 2 a.m, not because something had gone wrong, but because something had gone exactly right. I missed that part, the work itself, the problem solving at 3 a.m. when the stakes were real. But I don't miss the conference room. I don't miss the folder with the insulting number on the table. I don't miss the HR director who couldn't look at me. I have a desk now in the room off our kitchen. It's got a window that faces the backyard. Diane put a plant on the windowsill last spring and it is, miraculously, still alive. I work at that desk in the mornings, take a break around noon, pick it back up if I need to in the afternoon. Some days I close the laptop at 3 o'clock and go for a long walk. I'm 52 years old. I built something that mattered, and I have the documentation to prove I built it. I am comfortable. I am unhurried. The timing, as it turned out, was exactly what it needed to be. I've had a lot of time to think about how things unfolded. Not obsessively, I'm past that now. But in the quiet, honest way you think about things when enough distance has built up that you can look at them without flinching. What I keep coming back to is this. Preston didn't fail because he was malicious. He failed because he was careless, and carelessness at that level of consequence costs more than malice ever could. Malice at least requires you to understand what you're dealing with. Preston never understood what he was dealing with. He saw a number on a spreadsheet and a clause he hadn't read closely enough, and a decision that looked, from where he was standing, like easy money saved. He didn't see 18 years. He didn't see what CREST actually was, what it took to build, why the buyer wanted it in the first place. You cannot make good decisions about things you don't understand. That's not a judgment, it's just a fact, and it's a fact that eventually makes itself known whether you're ready for it or not. And Aldrich. I've thought about him more than I expected to. He was a fair man for a long time, and I think the version of him that offered me that contract, the version that included the IP reversion clause because he genuinely wanted me protected, that version was real. What happened at the end wasn't a revelation of his true character. It was a failure of it. There's a difference. People who have always had integrity can still lose it under enough pressure, in the wrong room, with the wrong people whispering in their ear. I don't excuse it, but I understand it, and understanding it means I don't have to carry it around. What I really learned in a way that's now wired into how I think about work and value and the agreements I make, is that the protection you build for yourself has to be as carefully constructed as anything else you build. I spent 18 years engineering redundancy into a water response system because I knew that a single point of failure could leave 40,000 households without pressure in a February freeze, and then I almost left my own professional life with one single point of failure. The assumption that the people above me would honor what they promised because they always had before. Diane's sister has a phrase she uses: hope is not a plan. I believed in Aldrich the way I should have believed in the contract. The contract held. Aldrich didn't have to. I'm not a harder person for having gone through this. I don't think that's the right takeaway. I'm a more clear-eyed one. I trust people still. I trust my attorney. I trust the engineers I worked with for a decade. I trust Diane completely. But I also document. I keep copies in 3 places. I read the clauses that seem like boilerplate. That's not cynicism. That's just what it looks like when you decide to take your own interests seriously. The work I do now is quieter. It matters, but it's mine. I set the terms. I leave at 3 when I want to. There's a plant on my windowsill that has somehow survived 6 months of my irregular attention. Some mornings I look at it and think, that's about right. You build the conditions. You stay consistent. You let the thing grow on its own schedule. That's enough.